Well, let's go to the Dominic Perrottet story around his appearance in a Nazi uniform on his 21st. And I'm going to bring in Vic Alhadeff, a former long-standing chief executive of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. He is someone who was telephoned by Dominic Perrottet once the Premier realised he had to come clean with this. Vic Alhadeff, thanks so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Andrew.
What was your reaction when Dominic Perrottet rang you last Thursday and said, I'm sorry about this, I dressed in a Nazi uniform on my 21st birthday?
Andrew, I speak to someone whose paternal grandparents were murdered in the Holocaust and a member of the Jewish people, 6 million of whom were murdered in the Holocaust. Having said that, it's really important to keep in mind that the Premier acknowledged the fact that he made a serious blunder, and I think there are very few of us who did not do something in our younger days which we subsequently regret. It is important to acknowledge that the Premier has apologised for that. It is also important that he has been a staunch friend of the Jewish community throughout his political career. And that speaks far more loudly than a youthful indiscretion which took place 2 decades ago.
Did he try to explain why he wore it? Was it an attempt at humour? Did you ask him, well, why did you do it?
He pretty much said almost exactly what he said at his press conference a little while later. And I didn't ask why. I mean, he said the same thing that he said in his press conference, that it was a mistake which he deeply regrets, a mistake which he is ashamed about, and appreciated the fact that he took the trouble to call, and very much have appreciated the fact that he has acknowledged that it was a serious blunder. And it's important to have that as the perspective, that he's acknowledged that it was a mistake and that he's embarrassed about it. And it's important to keep that in perspective, and that speaks far more loudly than what took place 20 years ago.
Could you see any situation where that kind of humour is acceptable? We remember Hogan's Heroes from our past, from my childhood, or is that just so deeply inoffensive to Jewish people, so deeply offensive, should I say, to Jewish people, donning that sort of costume in any circumstances?
Obviously, times have changed, and we've seen Fawlty Towers, where I'm sure most viewers will be familiar with Basil Fawlty and what he did. And so times have changed, where a program like Fawlty Towers was deemed acceptable, many years ago, 2-3 decades ago, and I dare say it would not be deemed acceptable today. So times change, customs change, and in terms of this situation, it's important to focus on the fact that the Premier did acknowledge what he did. And I see an opportunity here to derive a positive out of what has taken place. In other words, to segue from that to what is happening in our education system. The Holocaust has been taught in our schools in New South Wales, in Victoria, for a long time. But the situation in schools, I dare say, needs to go deeper than that and broader than that. And we see all manner of prejudices which are sadly quite commonplace in our country. So I would say in schools there needs to be a focus on anti-Semitism, on racism or prejudice against people of the First Nations sector, of the LGBTIQ, Asian sector, Muslim sector. And there is sadly prejudice against all different sectors happening in our society. And we can derive possibly a positive out of this issue which has been preoccupying us for the last few days. And if we can shine a light on what is happening in schools in terms of education and equipping our students to identify and be able to respond to prejudices against any demographic. Well, the Premier banned the display of swastikas last year. Do you think that's when he should have fessed up in terms of this? That is a matter for others to judge. I prefer to focus, and I think it's more important to focus on how we can move on from this in a positive way. As I say, the Premier has acknowledged what took place, and it's important now to focus on how we can move on from that, how we can equip our students, next generations, into dealing with this. I have been into too many schools in recent weeks and months where there have been swastikas, where students have gone on social media and said that, quote-unquote, Hitler was a great guy with amazing ideas. And this is happening in our leading schools here in New South Wales in this day and age. So we can segue from what took place what the Premier's spoken about to what needs to happen in our school system and why it is that in our school system today, we are still dealing with the issue. We see too many students who think it's a good thing to put swastikas up or to post horrendous messages on social media. Survey after survey, both in Australia and overseas, has come up with the findings that an inordinate number of people are unaware that the Holocaust even took place. And that is an alarming stat, and we have seen it in far more than one survey. And so Holocaust education is vital, but so is education against all forms of bigotry and prejudice.
Just briefly, when you talk about the schools, are you alluding to the Waverley College scandal highlighted by the Telegraph? And do you think these revelations will hurt Dominic Perrottet in a seat like Vaucluse?
I'm referring to instances which have taken place across a number of schools here in New South Wales, a number of leading schools, both private and public. And it is a escalating situation, and there has instructively there's been such a difference in the way some schools have responded, which has been showing leadership from the top, where schools have reached out proactively to say, we have a problem here, let's talk about how we can deal with it, to sadly some schools which have said it's not such a problem and have tend to sweep it under the carpet. So that is an important segue out of the situation, and that has been going on sadly for too long and has been escalating. Obviously, whenever there are times of stress, economic, political upheaval, and we had the pandemic for the last 3 years, people, not all people, but some people tend to look for simplistic explanations as to why jobs are being lost, cost of living goes up, and there are economic pressures. And some people tend to go to simplistic solutions as how to deal with this. And sadly, Andrew, we have seen, the word Charlottesville comes to mind. And just to remind viewers, Charlottesville is, in the United States, and not long ago, neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan, marched in Charlottesville, Virginia, carrying guns and torches and screaming blood and soil.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, I understand. Vic Alhadeff, we have to wrap it there, I'm afraid. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Andrew.